You know that sketchy part of town where nobody goes anymore? Boarded up houses, cracked streets, businesses that closed decades ago. That's not decay. That's a preview. Detroit's population crashed by 60%. An entire sea disappeared. A housing project got so bad they blew it up on live TV less than 20 years after building it. And here's what should terrify you. Your city is making the exact same mistakes right now. The question isn't if it'll collapse, it's when you'll notice it's already happening. What makes urban planning bad? Bad urban planning is when your city sacrifices your future for their quarterly budget report. If your city is tearing up bus routes to widen highways, you're watching it happen in real time. If officials are talking about necessary infrastructure compromises, you're being set up. If they're draining water sources for cash crops while telling you not to worry, they're engineering your disaster. The damage always shows up the same way. Property values crater, your neighbors leave, and entire neighborhoods empty out while politicians act surprised. When planners ignore how you actually live, when they prioritize cars over your commute, cotton over your water, or budget cuts over your health, they're not making mistakes. They're making choices, and those choices stick around way longer than the officials who made them. The warning signs are always obvious. Infrastructure that can't handle growth, transportation systems that trap you instead of connecting you, environmental damage that spirals into health crises that hit your family. By the time you realize what's happening, your city's already locked in. Detroit didn't fail accidentally. It was engineered. Lane by lane, highway by highway. Back in 1950, this was America's fifth largest city with 1,850,000 residents. A manufacturing powerhouse where people actually wanted to live. Then planners decided your neighborhood mattered less than highway speed. They ripped out the streetcar systems that had connected communities for decades and replaced them with concrete. The last streetcar ran on April 8, 1956. Between 1950 and 1960, highway projects and urban renewal programs displaced over 100,000 people total. Entire neighborhoods like Black Bottom and Paradise Valley just erased. Downtown's population dropped from 20,000 to fewer than 8,000 in a single decade. And the planners, they kept building highways, convinced they were building the future. If your city is widening highways right now while cutting public transit, this is the early stage of Detroit. You're watching the beginning. Between 1948 and 1967, Detroit lost over 130,000 manufacturing jobs, even while the auto industry was at its economic peak. The jobs left, but the highways stayed. When automotive manufacturing continued abandoning Detroit in the 70s and 80s, residents were trapped. They couldn't reach jobs in distant suburbs because the city had systematically destroyed public transportation. The city had designed itself into a trap, and it locked its residents inside. By 2010, Detroit's population had plummeted to 714,000, a 61% decline in 60 years. The city declared bankruptcy on July 18, 2013, owing $18 billion. Approximately 19 to 23 square miles sat vacant. By 2012, roughly 1/6 of Detroit's total land area transformed into empty lots. Houses sold for $1. $1. That's what happens when your city chooses highways over communities. Remember that next time officials promise a new road will bring economic growth. Flint, Michigan. Flint followed Detroit's deindustrialization playbook. Then officials decided to poison the water to save pocket change. Like Detroit, Flint boomed with the auto industry. General Motors made it a manufacturing powerhouse. When the factories closed in the 80s, Flint's population crashed from around 200,000 to less than 100,000. Nearly 1 in 6 homes abandoned. If you've ever wondered what happens when your city's main employer leaves, this is it. By 2011, Flint was carrying a $25 million deficit. Michigan Governor Rick Snyder appointed an emergency manager to slash costs. Democracy suspended. Accountant installed. This led to the decision that would poison an entire generation. On April 25th, 2014, Flint switched its water source from Detroit's system to the Flint River. The goal? Save about $5 million over 2 years. Officials knowingly skipped corrosion control chemicals to save money. They knew the Flint River was more acidic than Lake Huron. They knew what would happen without corrosion inhibitors. They did it anyway. The water started eating away at aging lead pipes. Lead leached into the supply, exposing around 100,000 residents to poison. Residents noticed immediately. The water smelled toxic, looked brown, tasted like chemicals. Children developed rashes that looked like frog skin. Adults lost hair in clumps. City and state officials kept lying, insisting the water was safe. Even when General Motors switched its plant back to Detroit water because the Flint River water was corroding its machinery, officials still denied there was a problem for human consumption. If the water destroyed machines, what was it doing to children? Officials didn't care enough to find out. It took 18 months of residents screaming before the state reconnected Flint to Detroit's water in October 2015. 18 months of children drinking lead. 12 people died in Legionnaire's disease outbreaks linked to the water switch. 79 others became ill. If officials in your city tell you water chemistry is too complicated to explain, remember Flint. If they say budget cuts won't affect services, remember Flint. If they ask you to trust them while your tap water looks brown, remember what happened when Flint residents trusted their government. The Michigan Civil Rights Commission concluded the response was systemic racism. The crisis hit a majority black city where about 1/3 live in poverty. The officials who made the decision didn't drink that water. Their children didn't bathe in lead. This is what happens when your city has infrastructure built for a larger population. Low water flow means water sits longer in pipes, corroding them faster. And when neighboring regions refuse cooperation, your city faces the crisis alone. Pruitt-Igoe. Pruitt-Igoe is what happens when your city cuts construction costs and calls it innovation. This project opened in 1954 on 57 acres in St. Louis's north side. 33 11-story buildings with 2,870 apartments, designed by architect Minoru Yamasaki. The city demolished the DeSoto car neighborhood, displacing thousands of black residents for what officials promised would be modern paradise. If your city is promising transformative development in historically black neighborhoods right now, pay attention. The cost cutting started immediately and never stopped. Buildings featured skip-stop elevators that only stopped on the 1st, 4th, 7th, and 10th floors. Residents had to climb stairs to reach apartments, a design choice made purely to save construction money. Elevators opened onto long galleries meant for community interaction, but planners removed furniture and lighting to cut expenses further. Laundry rooms were centralized, far from apartments, instead of on each floor. If new housing in your city cuts costs through innovative design, remember Pruitt-Igoe. Within years, those stairwells and galleries became crime hotspots. Robberies and assaults became routine. Maintenance funding was catastrophically inadequate by design. The St. Louis Housing Authority relied entirely on rent from low-income tenants for upkeep. Zero federal subsidy for buildings that required constant maintenance. The project had a higher vacancy rate from opening day than comparable projects. By the mid-60s, buildings were falling apart. Elevators broke down and stayed broken for months. Plumbing failed building-wide. Windows shattered and remained shattered. Some maintenance workers refused to enter the buildings. Residents called the galleries gauntlets because walking through felt like running through enemy fire. By 1970, 65% of units sat vacant. On March 16, 1972, the city admitted total defeat. They demolished the first building with explosives on national television. Less than 22 years after opening, they were blowing it up. Architecture critic Charles Jenks later declared July 15, 1972 at 3:32 p.m. as the day modern architecture died, though major demolitions had already begun in March. By 1976, every building was demolished. Everything gone. The project cost $36 million in 1951, equivalent to $443 million today. All wasted. All because officials chose cheap construction over livable homes. The pattern that's destroying your city right now. Here's what connects these disasters and what's happening in your city right now. They all started with decisions that made sense in spreadsheets but ignored how you actually live. Detroit's highways promised mobility but trapped anyone without a car. If your city's expanding highways while your bus routes get cut, you're in the early stage. Flint's water switch saved pennies in the budget while poisoning a generation of children. Pruitt-Igoe cut construction corners and created buildings that were unlivable from day one. But the real killer is what happens when you notice the problems. The people with power double down instead of changing course. Always. Detroit kept building highways while manufacturing jobs vanished and residents begged for alternatives. Flint residents screamed about poisoned water for 18 months before anyone with power listened. Pruitt-Igoe tenants organized rent strikes in 1969 while buildings kept crumbling and officials kept collecting rent. Cities that survive understand something your officials are ignoring. Infrastructure isn't just pipes and roads. It's the system that connects you to jobs, clean water, and safe neighborhoods. Break those connections, and everything else falls apart around you. Detroit learned this when its population collapsed by over 1 million people. Flint learned it when children tested positive for lead poisoning. St. Louis learned it when it had to demolish 33 towers less than 2 decades after construction. Your city will learn it too. The only question is how much damage happens before they admit the mistake. What happens when cities try to bounce back? So where do you even start after your city collapses? Detroit filed for bankruptcy in 2013, owing $18 billion. After hitting rock bottom, something unexpected happened. Private companies rehabilitated over 100 abandoned properties since 2010. Downtown population grew 18%. Michigan Central Station became a tech center instead of a monument to failure. But here's what they don't tell you. Detroit remains America's most segregated city. The downtown revival hasn't reached most neighborhoods. Drive 10 minutes from the rehabilitated center and it still looks like the city declared bankruptcy yesterday. If your city is celebrating downtown development while ignoring neighborhood collapse, you're watching managed decline with better PR. Flint's recovery is even messier. The city completed lead pipe replacement in July 2025, nearly 11 years after officials poisoned the water. The EPA lifted its emergency order after 9 years of passing water tests. Many residents still buy bottled water. They refuse to trust what comes out of their taps. When officials lie to you for 18 months while your children get poisoned, trust doesn't come back just because pipes get replaced. Would you trust them? The one outcome that matters. The crisis changed national policy. The Biden administration ordered all water systems nationwide to replace lead pipes within 10 years. Flint's suffering might prevent your city from poisoning your children. Might. The Pruitt-Igoe site? After demolition in 1976, the land sat empty for decades. Today, it's part of the Gateway Green project. Walking trails where towers once stood. It took nearly 50 years to turn that failure into something remotely usable. 50 years, breaking the cycle before it breaks you. The difference between cities that collapse and cities that adapt comes down to three things, and your city is failing at least two of them right now. First, listening before crisis hits. Flint residents noticed poison water immediately in 2014. Officials ignored them until October 2015. Detroit residents watched highways destroy their neighborhoods in the 50s. Planners kept building them anyway. If your city officials are dismissing community concerns as not understanding the bigger picture, you're watching the same pattern unfold. Cities that survive create systems where your voice reaches decision makers before problems become catastrophes. Does yours? Second, understanding that cheap now means expensive later. Flint saved $5 million switching water sources. The crisis has cost hundreds of millions in pipe replacement, health care, and lawsuits. Pruitt-Igoe cut construction costs and created unlivable buildings that needed demolition within 2 decades. True planning means calculating what maintenance, adaptation, and population shifts will cost over decades. Those aren't optional expenses you can skip. They're debts your city will pay whether officials budget for them or not. If your city is deferring maintenance to balance this year's budget, start paying attention to property values. Third, accepting that cities are living systems where everything connects. Detroit's highway system didn't just affect transportation. It destroyed neighborhoods, accelerated white flight, trapped residents without cars, and collapsed the tax base. Flint's water chemistry affected public health, property values, population retention, and national reputation. Change one thing and 20 other things shift in response. Your officials either understand this or they're engineering your city's collapse while calling it progress. The cities making these mistakes today look exactly like Detroit in 1950 or Flint in 2014. They're prioritizing short-term budgets over your long-term future. They're ignoring the warnings. They're treating infrastructure like it maintains itself while expecting you to pay for it. And 20 years from now, people will ask how they let it happen when all the warning signs were obvious, because they always were. You're seeing them right now. These weren't natural disasters. Detroit, Flint, and Pruitt-Igoe collapsed because people with power made specific choices that screwed you to benefit them. They chose highways over your neighborhood. They chose budget cuts over your safe water. They chose cheap construction over your livable home. The question isn't whether your city will face similar decisions. Your city's facing them right now. The question is whether the people making those decisions will learn from history or repeat it while you watch. Pay attention to what your city's building. Pay attention to what they're cutting. Pay attention to who's ignored when they raise concerns, because by the time everyone admits there's a problem, you will already be living in it.